Margaret stood in her modest kitchen, the early morning light streaming through the window. The faint hum of the refrigerator provided a familiar backdrop as she moved about, her hands deftly preparing breakfast for her son, Jacob. Every morning, this ritual had become second nature to her, a chore that came with both pride and an underlying fatigue. Despite the sunlight pouring in, there was a heaviness in Margaret's heart. After 23 years of caring for Jacob, the weight of their shared life pressed down on her. She recalled the day of his accident, the image of the car that had taken him away from her, leaving him trapped in a body that no longer obeyed his commands, flashed through her mind. It was a cruel twist of fate, one that had transformed her into a caregiver, a role she had embraced with unwavering devotion. But as the years passed, she found herself grappling with an unsettling feeling that something was amiss. As she set the table, her thoughts drifted. Jacob had always been her sunshine, her reason to keep going. His laughter, though sometimes stifled by the limitations of his condition, still resonated in the walls of their home. Yet, as she placed the last fork down, a flicker of doubt crossed her mind. Was he truly happy? Or was he simply accustomed to their routine? "Breakfast is ready," she called out, her voice echoing through the small house. Jacob's response came a moment later, soft and hesitant. "Okay, Mom. I'll be there in a minute." Margaret took her seat at the table, her heart swelling with a mix of affection and worry. She watched as Jacob wheeled himself into the dining room, his frame slightly slumped, but his eyes bright with the remnants of sleep. "Morning, Mom," he said, a smile breaking across his face. "Good morning, sweetheart," she replied, her tone warm, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was different today. As he positioned himself at the table, she noticed the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for the plate. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked, her brow furrowing with concern. "Yeah, just a bit stiff," Jacob admitted, shrugging as he began to eat. "You know how it is," Margaret nodded, but the unease gnawed at her. His stiffness was nothing new, but the way he spoke, as if trying to convince her, as if he was trying to convince himself, sent a shiver down her spine. She focused on her own breakfast, the toast dry in her mouth as she chewed slowly, contemplating the years that had passed. "Did you have any dreams last night?" she asked, hoping to steer their conversation toward lighter territory. "Just the usual," he replied, a wistful smile crossing his lips. "Nothing too exciting. Just you and your racing cars, I suppose," she teased gently. "Did you hear about the caregiver who was caught stealing from her patient?" one of them said, a note of incredulity in her voice. Margaret's heart raced as she leaned slightly to eavesdrop. "I can't believe it." She was taking all his money and lying about his condition. "It's just so wrong, right? You think you can trust someone and then they go and betray you like that," the other woman replied, her tone heavy with disapproval. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. Trust was the foundation of her relationship with Jacob, a bond she had nurtured for over 2 decades. The thought of betrayal, even in the context of a fleeting conversation, sent her thoughts spiraling. What if Jacob wasn't being completely honest with her? The idea that someone could manipulate their relationship gnawed at her, planting seeds of doubt in her mind. As she continued shopping, Margaret's thoughts raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Jacob's condition than he let on. Was he hiding something from her? The notion felt foreign and painful, but the words of the women echoed in her mind, intertwining with her own fears. After paying for her groceries, she drove home, her heart heavy with the weight of her thoughts. She put the groceries away, each item a reminder of the life they shared, the routines that defined their existence. Margaret couldn't help but glance at Jacob's room, the door slightly ajar, as if beckoning her to confront the truth that lay hidden within. With the evening approaching, she felt a mix of dread and determination. Something was off, and she knew she couldn't ignore it any longer. As she settled into her chair, the soft light of the setting sun streaming through the window, Margaret resolved to uncover the truth, whatever that might entail. She needed to protect Jacob, to ensure that their bond remained unbroken. But as the shadows lengthened, A flicker of unease settled deep in her heart, whispering that the answers she sought might lead her down a path she was not prepared to face. As she turned to check on Jacob, who sat in his wheelchair, she couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that had been creeping into her thoughts since their neighbor Sarah had come by to help with the housework. "Are you comfortable, Jacob?" she asked, her voice tinged with a mixture of affection and concern as she approached him. He looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips, but there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. "Yeah, Mom, I'm good," Jacob replied, adjusting himself in his chair. But Margaret noticed how he seemed to avoid her gaze. "Sarah was here for a while, wasn't she?" Margaret prodded gently, trying to keep her tone light. "Did she help you with the laundry?" Jacob shrugged, his gaze fixed on a spot just over her shoulder. "Yeah, a bit. She's been really nice. I appreciate having her around. I just want to make sure you're okay," Margaret said, feeling the need to assert her place in Jacob's life. "You know I'm always here for you, right?" "Of course, Mom." Jacob's voice was steady, but he still wouldn't meet her eyes. "You've always been here. Then why do you look like you're hiding something from me?" she asked, unable to contain her worry any longer. The vulnerability in his expression sent a rush of protective instinct through her. "I'm not hiding anything," he replied defensively, his tone sharper than she had expected. "I'm just trying to live my life, you know." Margaret felt a pang of hurt at his response. She had dedicated her life to ensuring he had the best care possible, yet here he was, pushing her away. "I just want what's best for you," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Jacob sighed, frustration etched on his face. "I know that, Mom. It's just, I'm not a child anymore. I can handle things." The silence that followed stretched between them like a chasm. Margaret turned away, feeling the weight of his words. The next morning, after breakfast, she donned her coat and grabbed her purse, feeling a mix of apprehension and determination. When she entered the local electronics store, the familiarity of the aisles calmed her nerves. She wandered through the rows of gadgets, her eyes scanning for the perfect hidden camera. It felt surreal, almost as if she were preparing for a clandestine operation, rather than seeking a tool to protect her son. "Can I help you?" A cheerful salesman approached, his name tag reading, "Tom." "Oh, yes," Margaret stammered, her cheeks flushing. "I'm looking for a camera. Something discreet." "Sure thing. We've got a few options. Are you thinking about using it inside or outside?" Tom asked, leading her to a section filled with various models. "Inside," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just to keep an eye on things." "Got it. This one here is perfect for indoor use. It's small, can be hidden easily, and has great resolution," he explained, holding up a sleek device. Margaret nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and guilt as she purchased the camera. She returned home, her heart racing with every step. Was she really about to invade her own son's privacy? But the thought of losing him, of not truly knowing what was happening behind closed doors, pushed her forward. As she set up the camera in the living room, carefully positioning it to capture the best angle, a surge of emotions washed over her. This was not the way she had envisioned their lives together. She had always wanted to protect Jacob, but now it felt as if she were stepping into a territory fraught with danger and betrayal. "Just for safety," she whispered to herself, trying to assuage her guilt. "Just to know the truth." With the camera in place, Margaret settled into her chair, her heart pounding. She hoped that her suspicions were unfounded, that the recordings would reveal nothing more than the mundane rhythm of their daily life. She could only pray that this decision would bring her peace, for the love she held for Jacob was unwavering, even amidst the shadows of doubt. As she adjusted the angle of the camera, her hands trembled slightly, betraying the turmoil brewing inside her. "What if I'm wrong?" she whispered to herself, glancing back at Jacob, who was in the adjacent room, focused intently on a puzzle. The sound of the pieces clicking together filled the silence, a stark contrast to the chaos in her mind. She had dedicated her life to caring for him, sacrificing her own needs for 23 years, and now she was questioning the very essence of their bond. With a deep breath, she turned the camera on. "This is just for peace of mind," she reassured herself, though her voice felt hollow. "Just a precaution." As she moved back to the kitchen to finish breakfast, a weight settled on her shoulders. The thought of betraying Jacob's trust gnawed at her, yet the flickering unease was stronger. Days passed, and the routine continued with a deceptive normalcy. Margaret found solace in the mundane moments, the way Jacob would smile at her when she brought him his favorite coffee, or how he would chuckle at the silly antics of their cat, Whiskers. But every evening, after Jacob was settled in bed, she would retreat to her computer, heart racing as she reviewed the footage from the hidden camera. At first, the recordings were mundane, showing Jacob engaged in activities that seemed perfectly ordinary. He would work on his puzzles, read books, or watch television. Margaret felt a sense of comfort watching him. It was as if she were being reassured that his life was indeed as she believed it to be. But as the days turned into weeks, that comfort began to erode. One evening, as she sifted through the footage, a flicker caught her eye. Jacob had been stretching his arms, but the fluidity of his movements felt too natural for someone paralyzed. Margaret leaned closer to the screen, her heart racing. "No, it can't be," she murmured, squinting as she played the segment again. He reached for a book on the shelf, with an ease that sent a chill down her spine. She paused the video, staring at the still image of Jacob, who looked so carefree, so normal. "What are you doing, Jacob?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice shaking. The familiar warmth she had felt about their life together started to chill, replaced by a gnawing unease. The next morning she couldn't shake the feeling. As she prepared breakfast, her mind raced with questions. Jacob wheeled himself into the kitchen, a bright smile on his face, completely unaware of the storm brewing in his mother's heart. "Good morning, Mom," he said cheerfully, his voice carrying a brightness that made her heart ache. "Morning, Jacob," she replied, forcing a smile. "You all right? You look a little off. Just tired, dear." "You know how it is," she said, trying to sound casual while her mind was still racing. Jacob nodded, but she could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. "You've been working hard. Maybe you should take a break." Margaret's heart sank at his suggestion. "I'm fine, Jacob. Really. Just a lot on my mind," she said, stirring the batter with more force than necessary. As they sat down to eat, Margaret's gaze flicked to the hidden camera, now a silent witness to her unraveling peace. "You've been doing your therapy exercises, right?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light, though the underlying tension was palpable. "Yeah, I've been trying to do more each day," Jacob replied, a hint of pride in his voice. "You know, I think it's really helping." "Helping how, exactly?" She pressed gently, watching him closely. He shrugged, poking at his pancakes. "Just feeling a bit stronger, I guess. You have to believe that I can improve, Mom. I'm not giving up." Margaret's heart twisted. "Of course, I believe in you, Jacob. It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm losing touch with what's real." After breakfast, Margaret retreated to her room, her mind spinning. Jacob's words echoed in her head, a constant reminder of the love she felt for him, and the haunting doubts that had begun to seep into her consciousness. As she sat on her bed, she felt an urge to review the footage once more, a need to confront the reality that had begun to fracture her world. That evening, with the sun setting behind the hills, Margaret settled in front of her computer, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. She watched the recordings with a renewed sense of urgency, her heart racing with each passing moment. As Jacob moved about the house, his movements appeared almost too fluid, too natural. "Why won't you just tell me?" she whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. Each passing day heightened her anxiety. The mundane routines that once comforted her now seemed like a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. Margaret knew she had to confront Jacob again, but the thought of facing him, of potentially shattering their fragile world, filled her with dread. "Jacob," she called softly, her voice barely rising above a whisper. "Can we talk?" There was a pause before he responded. "Sure, Mom. What's up?" The familiar sound of his voice drew her back into the moment, and she took a deep breath. "Can you come in here? I need to ask you something." "Okay," he said, wheeling himself into the room, a hint of confusion in his eyes. As he entered, Margaret felt the weight of her suspicions bearing down on her heart. I've been watching the footage," she started, her voice trembling. Jacob's expression shifted, the playful demeanor replaced by a cautious seriousness. "Footage? What footage?" "The camera. I set it up to see how you were doing. I thought it would help me understand, but..." "But what?" He pressed, his voice tightening. "I'm seeing things that don't add up, Jacob," she admitted, her heart racing. "You're moving differently than you should be," he blinked, processing her words. "Mom, I don't understand." "I told you I'm getting stronger," he insisted, but the edge in his voice was unmistakable. "I need you to be honest with me," she said, desperation creeping into her tone. "Are you really paralyzed, or is this all a lie?" The room fell silent, the air thick with tension as Jacob's jaw tightened. "What are you accusing me of?" he shot back, eyes narrowing. "I'm not accusing you of anything," she replied, her voice breaking. "I just need to know the truth." Jacob's expression hardened, and for a moment, Margaret saw a flicker of something else in his eyes. Something darker. "You don't trust me, do you?" he spat, the hurt evident in his tone. "I want to, Jacob. You shouldn't have been watching that," he said, his tone shifting to one of defensiveness. "It was an invasion of privacy." "An invasion of privacy? You've been lying to me for years." Margaret's voice rose, fueled by a mix of hurt and rage. "I saw you standing. You've been moving around when you thought no one was watching." Jacob's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "I'm not lying, Mom. I'm just getting stronger with my therapy. You need to trust me." "Trust you?" she echoed, incredulity flooding her voice. "How can I trust you when you've hidden the truth from me? What else have you been keeping from me?" He turned away, crossing his arms defensively. "You wouldn't understand. You don't know what it's like to be in my position." Margaret felt a swell of frustration. "You're right, Jacob. I don't know what it's like to be you, but I've dedicated my life to taking care of you, and this is how you repay me." "By lying? Maybe I didn't want you to worry," he shot back, his voice rising. "Maybe I wanted to feel normal for once. I didn't want you to see me as some broken man who needs to be taken care of." "Normal?" Margaret's heart ached at his words. "You're my son, Jacob. I love you just as you are. But this feels like a betrayal." The silence that followed was heavy. Jacob turned away from her, staring out of the window, his back rigid. Margaret's heart sank as she watched him withdraw into himself, the walls they had built around their relationship suddenly feeling insurmountable. "Mom, I never meant to hurt you," he finally said, his voice low and strained. "I just wanted to reclaim some part of my life. It's been so long since I felt free." Margaret's anger began to wane, replaced by a deep-seated sadness. "But at what cost, Jacob? You've kept me in the dark. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but all this time you've been living a lie." Jacob turned to face her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to be able to stand on my own 2 feet, even if it was just for a moment. I thought you'd understand." "I understand more than you think," she replied, her voice softening. "But I also need honesty. We're a team, Jacob. We face everything together." The tension in the room began to dissipate, but the chasm between them remained. As Margaret looked at Jacob, she felt a profound sense of loss, not just for the years of care and sacrifice, but for the trust that had been shattered in an instant. That night, Margaret tossed and turned in bed, her mind replaying the confrontation. The image of Jacob standing alone in the living room haunted her thoughts. She felt a deep ache in her chest, a combination of betrayal and a longing for the closeness they had once shared. As the hours passed, she stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. She had dedicated her life to caring for Jacob, but now, she wondered if that care had been misplaced. Had she been so consumed by her role as his caretaker that she had overlooked his needs as a person? The shadows of the room seemed to close in around her, mirroring the confusion in her heart. She replayed their argument, searching for the right words she could have said, the things she could have done differently. But no amount of reflection could change the reality of the situation. Margaret fell into a restless sleep, her dreams filled with fragmented images of Jacob, his laughter, his pain, and now, his secrets. As dawn broke, the light filtered through the curtains, illuminating the room with a soft glow. She felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to him, to mend the rift that had formed between them. But the truth loomed large, and with it, the question of how to rebuild their relationship after such a deep betrayal. She knew they would need to confront it together, but the path forward felt uncertain and fraught with challenges. Would Jacob ever fully open up to her again? And could she trust him with her heart after everything that had happened? As she prepared for the morning, she resolved to seek clarity, both for herself and for Jacob. She needed to understand the depths of his truth, and perhaps in doing so, they could find a way back to each other. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, the remnants of breakfast still scattered across the surface. Empty plates, a half-drunk cup of coffee, and the morning newspaper, its headlines blaring as loudly as her racing thoughts. She felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her chest, a heaviness that had settled there ever since she uncovered the truth behind Jacob's secret life. A knot twisted in her stomach as she recalled the footage she had watched the previous night, the raw, unsettling images of her son standing, moving with an ease that had once seemed impossible. "Margaret, you need to talk to someone," she whispered to herself, as if hoping to coax the truth from the silence of the room. She needed clarity, a voice of reason in this chaotic storm of doubt and betrayal. With a resolve that surprised even her, she picked up the phone and dialed Helen's number, her longtime friend who had often been a source of wisdom. The phone rang, and Margaret felt each chime echoing the urgency of her need for support. "Helen," she breathed, relieved when her friend picked up. "It's me, Margaret. It's been a while. How are you?" Helen's voice was warm and inviting, a balm on Margaret's troubled heart. "I'm not sure how to say this," Margaret hesitated, her voice trembling slightly. "I need to talk. It's about Jacob, of course. Come over. We can have tea and you can tell me everything," Helen replied, her tone shifting to one of concern. Margaret agreed and hung up. The drive to Helen's house felt interminable, the familiar roads morphing into a blur, as her mind raced with thoughts of Jacob's deception. She parked her car and stepped into the cozy living room. Helen was already there, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her face radiating warmth and compassion. "Sit down, dear," Helen said, pouring tea into 2 delicate cups. "Now, tell me what's troubling you." Margaret took a deep breath, gripping the cup tightly. "I've been watching Jacob," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I set up a hidden camera. I thought it would help me understand his behavior better. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid." Helen's eyes widened, a mixture of surprise and concern flickering across her face. "What did you see?" Margaret's throat tightened as she recounted the shocking footage. The moment Jacob stood, the way he moved fluidly, as if he wasn't paralyzed at all. She described the feelings of betrayal that surged through her, the emotional turmoil that had left her reeling. "He's been lying to me, Helen, all these years." Her voice broke, and she took a shaky sip of tea to steady herself. "Margaret, this is serious," Helen replied gently. "What if I'm misinterpreting everything? What if he really is getting better? Then you'll find peace in knowing the truth," Helen said firmly. "But you owe it to yourself and to Jacob to dig deeper. Love is built on trust, and if that trust is broken, It's time to address it. Margaret nodded slowly, considering her friend's words. I know I have to find out what's really going on. It's just, I've devoted my life to caring for him. What if my entire life has been a lie? Helen reached across the table, placing her hand over Margaret's. You're a strong woman, Margaret. Whatever the truth is, you will handle it. You've been his rock, but you also deserve to have your own truth. With renewed determination, Margaret left Helen's house, her mind swirling with possibilities. That night, she began her research, diving into medical articles and studies about paralysis and rehabilitation. She spent hours poring over information, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she sought to understand Jacob's condition better. Days turned into nights, and with each passing moment, Margaret uncovered inconsistencies in Jacob's medical history. Diagnoses that didn't quite add up. Treatment plans that seemed overly simplistic for the severity of his condition. The more she read, the more her heart sank. It was as if the foundation of her life had begun to crumble beneath her. Finally, after countless hours of research, Margaret returned home one afternoon, her head spinning with information and her heart heavy with uncertainty. She felt the weight of her discoveries pressing down on her. She knew she had to confront Jacob again, but a part of her was terrified of what she might find. As she entered the house, she was greeted by the familiar sight of Jacob in his wheelchair, his gaze focused on the television. The scene felt painfully normal, yet the tension in the air was palpable. Margaret felt a lump form in her throat as she approached him. Jacob, she began, her voice steady but soft. We need to talk. He turned to her, a flicker of concern crossing his face. What is it, Mom? I've been doing some digging, she said, choosing her words carefully. About your condition, your treatment. There are things that don't add up. Jacob's expression shifted, a flash of defensiveness passing over his features. What do you mean? I'm getting better. You've seen the progress I've made. Progress? She challenged, feeling the anger rise within her. You're standing, Jacob. You're moving around when you think I'm not watching. Don't you dare lie to me. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the room was filled with an uncomfortable silence. I can explain, he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Explain what? Margaret demanded, her heart racing. That you've been deceiving me all these years? That you've taken advantage of my love and trust? Mom, please. Jacob pleaded, his voice cracking. You don't understand. It's complicated. Complicated. She echoed, disbelief etched on her face. You think it's complicated for me? I've spent my life caring for you, sacrificing everything. How could you do this to me? As emotions flared, Jacob's defensiveness crumbled, leaving him vulnerable. I didn't want to hurt you. I thought if I could walk again, I could finally be free. But I was scared. I didn't want to disappoint you. Margaret's heart ached at his words, but the betrayal still stung. You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth. Instead, you've kept me in the dark. I thought I could manage it on my own. Jacob replied, tears glistening in his eyes. But I didn't want to lose you. You've always been my everything. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. Margaret felt torn between her love for her son and the anger that bubbled just beneath the surface. As the day wore on, she found herself glancing at the clock, anxious for the moment when she could review the new footage. The hours dragged, filled with the mundane tasks of housework and caring for Jacob, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Every time she passed by the living room, the hidden cameras seemed to loom larger in her mind, beckoning her to see what they had captured. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the windows. Margaret settled onto the worn couch and powered up the monitor connected to the cameras. She felt a mix of dread and anticipation as she prepared to dive into the recordings. The static buzz of the screen filled the room, and her heart raced. The first few clips were uneventful, showing the quiet routine of their home. Margaret folding laundry, Jacob in his wheelchair, the mundane ebb and flow of their lives. But then, as she fast-forwarded through the footage, her breath caught in her throat. There it was, a flash of movement in the background. She slowed the playback, her heart pounding. In the dim light of the living room, Jacob appeared, but he wasn't alone. A figure, tall and familiar, stepped into view. It was Sarah, the neighbor. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief as she watched Jacob rise from his wheelchair, moving with an elegance that seemed impossible given his supposed condition. He walked across the room laughing with Sarah, their camaraderie evident in their easy banter. "Come on, Jacob, you can do better than that," Sarah teased, her voice light and playful. "Just give me a moment, Sarah. It's harder than it looks," Jacob responded, a grin plastered across his face. Margaret's heart sank. The reality of the situation crashed over her like a tidal wave. How could he be walking? Her hands trembled as she clutched the remote, pausing the footage to absorb the shocking sight. Was this some cruel deception? Had everything she believed been a lie? The recordings continued, revealing more interactions between Jacob and Sarah. They shared inside jokes, and the warmth between them was palpable. Margaret felt a deep pang of betrayal. Was Jacob not the son she had cared for all those years, but instead a man who had hidden his abilities and deceived her? Thought twisted in her mind like a dagger, and she quickly closed the video feed, her breath coming in short gasps. She needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront Jacob directly. "Jacob," she began, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "We need to talk." He opened his eyes, a hint of confusion clouding his features. "What's wrong, Mom? You look upset." "Upset? That's an understatement," she snapped, surprising herself with the sharpness of her tone. "I've seen the footage, Jacob. I know what you've been doing." His expression shifted instantly. "What do you mean?" he asked, feigning innocence. "I saw you. You were walking with Sarah, laughing, acting as if you were perfectly fine." Her voice trembled, a mixture of anger and hurt flooding her. "How could you do this to me, after everything I've sacrificed for you?" Jacob's face hardened, and he sat up in bed, the sheets rustling around him. "You don't understand, Mom. You don't know what it's like to be trapped in this body. I wanted to prove I could do it. I wanted to make you proud." "Proud? You think I'd be proud of this deceit? You've made a mockery of our lives." Margaret's voice cracked, tears pooling in her eyes. Jacob's expression shifted, revealing a vulnerability she had never seen before. "I was scared, Mom. I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to feel like your care was wasted." Margaret took a step back, her heart aching. "Wasted? Jacob, I love you. I've spent 23 years caring for you, and now I find out that you've been lying to me. How can I trust you now?" In that moment, the door creaked open, and Sarah stepped into the room, her presence unsettling the already charged atmosphere. "Margaret," she began cautiously, "I think we need to talk." Margaret turned her gaze toward Sarah, her anger reigniting. You've been a part of this all along. How could you encourage him to deceive me? This isn't just about you two. It's about my son and my trust. Please, let me explain," Sarah urged, raising her hands in a placating gesture. "Jacob's been going through a lot, and he didn't want to burden you. But he's not the person you think he is. There's so much you don't know." Margaret felt her heart pound in her chest, the weight of Sarah's words pressing down on her. "What do you mean?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting to Jacob, who wore a mixture of dread and hope on his face. "There's a truth about Jacob's condition that he hasn't shared with you. It's not just paralysis. There are layers to this, and he's been hiding it because he didn't want you to worry." "What are you talking about?" Margaret demanded, her voice rising. "What could possibly justify this deception?" Jacob moved to speak, but Sarah interjected, her voice steady. "Margaret, please, you need to hear this. Jacob has been struggling with something much deeper than just his physical condition. It's tied to his mental health, to his sense of identity. He didn't want to lose you, and he thought that if you believed he was still reliant on you, he wouldn't be abandoned." Margaret's mind raced as she processed Sarah's words. The room felt like it was closing in on her, and the truth was a swirling storm, threatening to engulf her. She looked at Jacob, searching for the boy she had fought to protect for over 2 decades, now standing before her as a man who had hidden pieces of himself from her. "Is this true, Jacob?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Have you been hiding more than just your ability to walk?" His eyes glistened, a mixture of shame and defiance. "I didn't want to hurt you, Mom. I thought if you saw me struggling, you would think I was less of a son, less deserving of your love." The weight of his confession hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting them. Suddenly, the love that had been the foundation of their relationship felt precarious, teetering on the edge of betrayal and understanding. Margaret's heart raced as she grappled with the enormity of what she had just learned. Was Jacob's care a facade, or was it an expression of a deeper struggle that she had failed to see? The lines of trust and love began to blur, leaving her gasping for clarity in a reality that had shifted beneath her feet. As she stood there, caught between the past and an uncertain future, the room filled with silence, each breath heavy with unspoken truths. The cliffhanger of their lives hung in the balance, and Margaret knew that nothing would ever be the same again.